So now we've got our background and our bird moves just how we want him to, up and down like that. Wonderful. The next thing to add is the tubes. So here's a quick challenge for you. Can you add the tubes using top tube and bottom tube so that they are the top one coming down from the top like that and the bottom one coming up from the bottom so that there's a certain gap in the middle of them? Good luck. I hope you managed it. Here we go. I'm going to start by creating textures for them. So we're going to have a texture called top tube and a texture called bottom tube. We'll do all the tube stuff together here. So top tube is going to be a new texture from toptube.png, and bottom tube is also going to be a new texture, but of course this time from bottomtube.png. There we go. So now let's add them in, and we'll add them here where the game state is not 0, so i.e. the game is active. So we'll need to start a batch. Then I'll just add the batch end command there as well. And then, as before, we need batch.draw. And the texture, I'll start with top tube. Now let's think about where we want to put this. So we want the x coordinate first. So the top tube, we want the bottom left to be around here. So if there's the center of the screen, we want it shifted up by half of whatever the gap is going to be. So we've got the gap between the two tubes there. So if there's the center of the screen, we want it shifted up by half of the gap and left by half of the width of the tube. So that will keep it central. So if we get the center of the screen, which we get from gdx.graphics.getWidth. So that's the width of the screen. Divide that by 2 to get the center of the screen, and then we want to subtract the width of the tube. So that's top tube dot width or get width divided by 2. So that's the x coordinate. The y coordinate is fairly similar. We're going to get the gdx.graphics.getHeight, and we want to divide that by 2. And we want to add half of the gap. Now the gap is something that we might want to alter to make the game easier or harder. So I'm going to create that as a float. And I'll start off with it at 400 and see how that works out. So we want half of the gap. There we go. And we don't need to specify the width and height because we can just use the default width and height of the sprites themselves. And then very similar for the bottom tube. So the x coordinate is going to be exactly the same. So gdx.graphics.getWidth over 2. And we'll use bottom tube, even though they both have the same width. It doesn't really matter. The y coordinate is going to be a bit different though, because for the top tube, we wanted the bottom left to be around here. For the bottom tube, the bottom left is actually going to be way off the bottom of the screen. So we're going to want to get to the center, then subtract half the gap to move half the gap down, and then subtract the height of the tube to take us to the bottom left of the tube, which is going to be way down here somewhere. So we get that using gdx.graphics.getHeight over 2 minus gap over 2 and minus, again, the height of the tube. So bottom tube dot get height. And just before we run that, we're going to have one issue here, and that is that the background is drawn after the tubes, and because the background is full screen, that's going to be on top of the tubes. So you won't actually see the tubes at all. So that's not great. So what I'm going to do is actually begin the batch right at the beginning here, and then we'll draw the background first, and then we'll just use the same batch here to draw the tubes. So then we're drawing background first, and then the tubes, and then the bird. The bird is never going to be on top of the tubes anyway, so that doesn't really matter. But even if it was, we'd probably want the bird to be in front of the tubes. So I'm happy with that ordering. So a quick summary there. The order that you draw these in is the order that they will be displayed or layered on the screen. So the later ones will be in front of the earlier ones. Okay, let's have a look. And there we go. There's our tubes. Wonderful. So happy with that. I'll keep that distance as 400 for the moment. When we play the game, we might adjust it, but that looks all right to me. Now, next thing we're going to need is to randomize the position of the tubes. We don't want them to be central every time. We want them to shift up and down. The tricky question is, how much do we want to move them up and down? Well, we want to use the full height of the screen, really, but we obviously don't want them off the top of the screen. I think what I'm going to do is consider this to be half of the gap, and then say another 100 for that bit there, because we don't want that bit to be off the screen, I don't think, either. So then the maximum amount that we want to move them up from the center point is going to be half of the height of the screen, which will take them right to the top, minus half of the gap, and then that 100 for this top bit here. So that was half of the height of the screen minus half of the gap minus 100. So let's set that up. So that's going to be maximum tube offset, so the amount it's moved up and down. And that's going to be a float. And we'll set, oops, sorry, I actually want to set that up here. And then we'll set it here as well. So max tube offset, as I said, was going to be half the height of the screen. So gdx.graphics.get height over 2 minus half of the gap. So gap over 2 minus 100. And then we're going to need a random number generator to generate our random gap. So let's set that up. We're going to have a random, I'll call it random generator. Bring that in. So down here, what I'm actually going to do temporarily is create a new random number every time the screen is tapped, and then we'll just see that it is randomly moving up and down. But then we'll move that code to somewhere better later on, because we don't want to move the pipes every time the screen is tapped in the final game. So let's have a float tube offset. And we're going to set that here. So tube offset. And we want a random generator. I don't think we've actually set up our random generator. So let's do that here. It's just going to be a new random. And then we want to create a float from that random generator. And remember, random generator.nextFloat creates a random number between 0 and 1. So first off, we want to not have a number between 0 and 1, but we want to have a number between a half and minus a half, because we're working from the center of the screen here. So I'm going to take my random number generator and subtract 0.5 from it. I need to specify that that 0.5 is a float, so that the types are not a problem. So now we've got a random number between 0.5 and minus 0.5. We want to multiply that by the kind of scale factor, as it were. So remember, we wanted our maximum value to be half of the top of the screen minus half of the gap minus 100. Now we've already got a half here because the maximum of this is 1/2. So if we get the top of the screen, that's gdx.graphics.get height, and then subtract the gap. So this will mean that if this has a maximum value of 1/2, then the maximum value of the whole thing is going to be half of the height minus the gap, which is almost what we want, but we wanted it to be half of the height minus the gap minus 100. So we're going to need to minus an extra 200 there, because remember, we're multiplying by 1/2 here. So this will give us a maximum possible value of this times 1/2 minus this times 1/2 minus that times 1/2, and a minimum value of the negative of all of that. So in short, we're going to go from the center of the screen and we're going to move up to around there. So the top of the screen minus the gap minus 100 pixels. Okay, so that's our tube offset. So all we need to do is add that to each of the y coordinates here. There we go. So that will shift it up or down depending on whether the random number here is more or less than 1/2. So now every time we tap that, that should give us a new tube offset. So we should see these tubes moving up and down with each tap. Let's take a look. Here we go. So first tap, excellent. And then wonderful. Look at that. They're shifting up and down perfectly, and they're not going too high and they're not going too low. Wonderful. Okay, and there's my bird. Right, so I'm very happy with my tubes. The last thing that we're going to want these tubes to do is move to the left. So let's set that up. I'm going to create a tube velocity. And I've tried this out. I reckon a tube velocity of 4 should work out about right. And then we're going to need to keep track of the tube's x coordinate, because that's going to change as it's moving left. So I'll call that tube x. And then initially we want to set tube x to be this value here, which was our initial x coordinate. So that's tube x now. And same with this one. And then let's see what happens if each time we decrease tube x by 4. And actually what I'm going to do is again reset tube x each time we tap, just so that we can bring the tube back into the middle and get a good look at it when we want to. Here we go. So we'll tap, and there it is, moving at what I think is a perfectly good speed to the left. Wonderful. So now we've got our tube more or less behaving as we'd like. What you're probably thinking is, how are we going to create more than one tube? Well, the way I'm going to do it, and as often the case, so there's lots of solutions to these problems, is I'm going to have 4 sets of tubes, so top and bottom, and I'm going to move them from the right to the left, and then when they're off the screen to the left, I'm going to change their X position so that they jump back to the right of the screen. And that will look like an unlimited, infinite set of tubes coming from the right to the left, but actually there's only 4 of them. And I've chosen 4 just because if you were playing this on a big screen, then you might be able to see lots of tubes at once. On this screen, we could probably get away with 3 or maybe even 2, but I'm going to go with 4 just to be safe. And I'm also going to put them half a screen width apart. And if I do that, then we shouldn't have any problems with missing tubes or not enough tubes to display to the user. All right, so let's have a couple more variables. Whoops, up here. So I'll have number of tubes as a variable, and that's going to be 4. Oh yes, I forgot to actually use my tube velocity here, didn't I? Rather than fix that, let's call that tube velocity. Great, so number of tubes is 4, and also distance between tubes. You don't have to put these up here, but it just makes them very easy to edit later on if you decide that the game is too easy or too difficult, or you want to change it in some way. So here we can set up the distance between tubes, as I said, half the width of the screen, so gdx.graphics.getWidth divided by 2. Okay, now let's create these tubes. So some of these we're going to need to change them slightly. So we're not going to have just one tube X now, we're going to have 4. So I'm going to make this an array of floats. And so this is going to be a new float array with a size of 4. Or in fact, we could use size number of tubes. And it doesn't like that because I need number of tubes to be an integer. That's fine. There's no reason it needs to be a float. Okay, similarly, the offsets are going to be different for each pair of tubes. So let's make those an array as well. Okay, so then down here, we're going to set up our tubes. So I'm going to do this with a for loop. So we'll have an I which starts at 0. It carries on as long as it's less than the number of tubes, and each time it increments. So for each pair of tubes, initially we want to set their x-coordinate and their offset. So let's now bring our code out of the just touch method and into the create method. So instead of tube offset now, we're using tube offset I. And similarly, tube X, we want to be tube XI. And so that first one, the offset, that's absolutely fine as it is, because we want each one to be random. But for this one, we don't want each to have the same x-coordinate. We want, for now, the first one to have that x-coordinate, because we want it to appear in the middle of the screen so we can see it straight away. But later on, we're going to want to add to that so that the first one is off the edge of the screen. But for each one, we're going to want to multiply I by the distance between the tubes. So the first one's going to be in the center, the second one is going to be half a screen away, because distance between the tubes is half a screen, the third one's going to be a whole screen away, and the fourth one is going to be 1.5 screens away. Alright, so that should now create the necessary tubes. So let's now display all of those tubes. So I'm going to copy this for loop because I want exactly the same for loop here. There we go. And instead of tube X, we want tube XI and tube XI again. And then we're still using top tube and bottom tube. They don't change from one to the other, but tube X does. So we're now working with tube XI, and we also want tube offset I rather than just tube offset. Okay, so with any luck, that should now display 4 tubes, all with random offsets, so up and down from the center, and they should move steadily from the initial position to the left. Here we go. Let's have a look. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm happy with that. The one issue that you may have noticed, of course, is that the tubes are disappearing. They're moving to the left and then they're not doing anything else. So as I said, we need to do a check to make sure that when they get off the edge of the screen, then they are shifted back over to the right of the screen. So we'll do this a check here. So if tube X I is less than, now we need to be a little bit careful, we can't just use 0 because then it will magically move over even when it appears on the screen there. So we actually want to use minus and then the width of the top tube or bottom tube, it doesn't really matter which we use. So that will make sure that it's off the edge of the screen because it will have gone to the coordinate down here somewhere, which is one tube's width to the left of the screen. So it definitely will be fully off the screen by this point. So if that's the case, we want to shift it to the right. And to do that, we're going to take tube XI and add to it, well, we're going to want 4 half screen widths because that's the total distance between our tubes. But in the general case, that's going to be number of tubes multiplied by distance between tubes. So that should shift it over to the right the correct amount so that it can then come back in again. And then if it's not off the edge of the tubes, off the edge of the screen, sorry, then we'll move it to the left as we initially planned. Okay. While that's compiling, I did think that perhaps the tubes were slightly too close together. So let's just try changing that to, instead of half the screen width, we'll change it to 3/4 of the screen width. Just to see, doesn't really matter, but I think that'll make the game a little bit more playable. Okay, so now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Are we going to get another tube? We are. There's the 5th one. And brilliant. So those tubes are now coming thick and fast all the way. Brilliant. So now we've got our tubes. We've got them hopefully a reasonable distance apart. The main thing, obviously, that the game is not currently doing is any kind of collision detection. So we obviously want the bird to, if it hits the tubes, for the game to be over. And that's what we're going to do in the next video. See you there.